the basis of a genuine social interaction is something like an offering, right? So if you and I want to establish a relationship, it's a good idea for me to bring something to the table and give it to you. From what I understand, this is how warring tribes in the default tribal condition of humanity started to trade. So what seems to happen, human beings have been around for about 350,000 years, and we didn't seem to get our act together until about 20,000 years ago. You might ask what the hell we were doing for the 330,000 years before that. And one answer is tearing down anyone who had any modicum of success whatsoever and fighting endless tribal battles. And so then you might ask, how the hell do you get out of that? Because that's kind of a self-sustaining dead end. So imagine a tribal group here and a tribal group here, and this group is watching this group and vice versa. And this group sees that this group has some cool stuff that they maybe would like to have and vice versa. Then imagine there's a no man's land of disputed territory between them. Sometimes a tribe will get the bright idea of taking some of their valuable stuff and leaving it in the no man's zone, just abandoning it, and then retreating. Then the other tribe will come in and take the stuff. Now, they could just take the stuff and leave. But now and then, the other tribe figures out, well, if they left some cool stuff, then maybe there would be more valuables forthcoming. But the interesting thing about that initiation, that process, is there's a sacrificial offering at the beginning, right? You have to give something up. And I do think it's that act of giving something up voluntarily that actually defines, well, I think it defines the psyche with integrity, but even more importantly, it defines society. It's not power. It's not power. It's
so
the
within
antithesis
as well as
of power.
between societies.
Within the individual and between, yeah. I think we establish psychological integrity by having each of our internecine drives give something up in relationship to an emergent totality. That's what happens when you mature, right? You start sequencing your whims in a way that allows each of them to attain their end, but in some order over some time period in relationship to some goal. Some of that goal would be the establishment of genuine social interactions. But all that's sacrificial. Now, it looks to me like the biblical stories are an examination of sacrifice, like an interrogation of sacrifice.
And Christ being the ultimate
well,
story.
Exactly. Because once you understand that voluntary sacrifice is the basis of civilization and community, the next question that emerges is, well, what's the highest possible form of sacrifice? And that's actually the quest, you might say, that the biblical stories arrange themselves around, because you establish the principle of sacrifice actually with Adam and Eve right at the end of that story, but certainly with Cain and Abel. There's two patterns of sacrifice established there, the pattern of Abel and the pattern of Cain. But then that's fleshed out as all the stories progress, and in principle that culminates in what we construe as the ultimate sacrifice, which is something like a total sacrifice, right? So then you might ask yourself, is it true that a totalizing sacrifice is the basis of social abundance? This is why Christ is the miraculous provider of the water that eternally replenishes and the fish that multiply and the bread that doesn't end. The idea is that if you establish the right pattern of sacrificial identity, you produce a society that is endlessly abundant. It's like a meta principle of provision, and it's based on the idea of sacrifice. And it seems to me, I think what's revolutionary about our time is that I think we can now understand that, like explicitly, instead of it being buried in our stories.
With regard to the national identity, forgive me for going there, and what I'm reading from what you're saying, but maybe I've got this wrong, is that there's a correct interplay, a correct sacrifice that the nation should have for the individual and the individual should have had for the nation. There's a certain amount of the individual should give to the nation and the nation in return.
Well, that would be something like, you see that also in the biblical stories, say in the story of Abraham with the establishment of the idea of covenant.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So what happens with Abraham, this is dead relevant as far as I'm concerned. So God comes to Abraham as the voice of adventure. He says to Abraham, if you leave your zone of comfort and venture out into the terrible world, I'll make you 4 offerings. And one is, your life will be a blessing to yourself. Another is that your reputation will become enhanced among your compatriots for valid reasons. Mm-hmm. The third is that you'll establish something of multi-generational permanence. And the fourth is you'll do it in a way that will increase universal abundance. Mm-hmm. And I think those 4 offerings each speak to the heart of man, you might say.
Yeah.
People want status, for example. So what the story does is it stacks. It's so interesting. It stacks the developmental instinct, which might be that search for expansive adventure that would take a child away from his home and then turn him into a teenager and then a man, that willingness to venture into the world. It hypothesizes that that's a divine instinct and that its full manifestation will produce the proper social ordering. So it unites the instinct for individual development with the pattern of social interaction that produces permanent abundance. And that seems to me to be right. And so a national identity in part is going to be a variant of that offering. It's right. You're going to offer something to the community wholeheartedly. And the consequence of that there'll be an offering in return.
And so there's just on that, because an added problem, I think, for the British and the English, if we're going to use biblical terms, is that covenant. You use that. Now, the Israelites are going in and out of, if you read through the Old Testament, they're in and out of covenant. They break their covenant with God.
Continually,
even after Moses brings them to the promised land, then you have Joshua, but then the book of Judges, they break their covenant. They have false gods and they have this chaos. And
they fragment. They pursue power. They pursue hedonism.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's kind of what we're experiencing now. We can't quite agree what that covenant is. I mean, it's even taboo now to suggest we're a Christian country. So even though, our flag is Christian, even though our national anthem starts with the word God.
Your king is head of the church.
Our king is head of the church.
Nominally.
That has been tied in with one of it's not quite taboo, but it actually was taboo to even say you're a Christian until the last 5 years or so. When I started the music industry, I was told, whatever you do, don't tell anyone you're Christian, even though I wasn't at the time. Mm-hmm. And that might have changed, but we are so lost. We have so broken our covenant as a nation with who we were, who founded us, that I guess it's the period of Judges. So not only how can we work out what the correct relationship is with the nation where we can't even identify what the nation is?
Right. Well, we have exactly the same conundrum in Canada. I mean, it's so interesting watching Canada's response to Trump's proclamation that our nation should become the 51st state. Because one of the consequences of that is that the same Justin Trudeau who announced formally that Canada had no national identity, that we were a post-national state, and that we had no unifying history, nothing but a legacy of oppression and racism, is now flying the flag. Even though he has stated in no uncertain terms that there is no unifying force behind the Canadian project. But there is no difference between that and the kind of fragmentation that makes you desperate psychologically and unbelievably weak as a nation, right? Because there is nothing pulling you together. But the fundamental question is, well, what is the proper unifying principle?
Yes.
Right? And so you said, for example, that we threw out the nation and even intermediary patriarchal structures after World War II because we were afraid of the proclivity of those arrangements to degenerate into, say, fascism or communism. And fair enough. But you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
One of the things that you might ask yourself is, how do you stop national identity from sliding into fascist ethno-nationalism?
Yes.
And the American solution to that has been one nation under God.
Yeah. Or
right?
pluribus unum. Of
right.
many one.
Right.
But they were founded as a multicultural nation where they found a a meta-narrative
Yeah.
to unite all the subcultures.
Right.
Europe has a completely different
Well,
problem.
the strange thing is, though, that the Americans only managed that because they were British, right? I mean, America gave more explicit voice to the principles that English common law, for example, and English identity, for that matter, had already established. The Canadian take on the American War of Independence was always Englishmen fighting for their rights. You know, the Americans think about it really as a revolution in quality, but Canadians think of it as, no, it's a return to the Americans of the rights of the British that they were denied. And I think that's more accurate.